Who was the true author of Shakespeare's works? The topic has been argued for the longest time. There isn't much supporting William Shakespeare. Do you believe that this young age and no recorded prior knowledge is author is the true author? And I believe it's hard to believe so. My partner and I believe that William Shakespeare is not the author of the real works, but someone else is. Therefore, that we believe that Edward de Vere is the true author of William Shakespeare works. My first point is that Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, is known as composed, directed, and acted in plays around the same time as Shakespeare. Like Shakespeare, he was part of an acting troupe, but unlike Shakespeare, Edward managed his acting troupe called Oxford Boys. Furthermore, Edward de Vere was a leaseholder of Blackfriars Theatre, a rival to the Globe Theatre. He was among one of the first to compose love poetry at the Elizabeth court and was praised playwright. Although none of his plays survived, a stream of dedications praised him for his works of literature, religious, musical, and medical. My second point is, while most academics agree that Edward de Vere's poetry was better than Sir Francis Bacon's, few believe it's of a standing necessary to prove de Vere wrote the 154 sonnets claimed to be authored by Shakespeare. Some similarities in Edward de Vere's verse to Shakespeare suggest, however, that such a leap in poetry was possible. Specifically, 6-line pentameter stanzas in Venus and Adonis reoccur in Edward de Vere's early poems and yet are not repeated by other poets of Shakespeare's time. Both Joseph Sorwin and J. Thomas Lonely have noted that the similarities in form between Edward de Vere's work and claim to be Shakespeare's. My third point is it's recognized by Oxfordians and Stratfordians alike that writing about royal courts, Italy, and law required a certain requisite level of education. Edward de Vere fits this because he had known to graduate Cambridge University at the age of 14 years old and arts at the age of 16. Furthermore, in view of playlists like The Merchant of Venice, which discuss law, de Vere studied law at Gray's Inn account books. His account books clearly show that de Vere had an extensive library underlining his qualifications to write knowledgeably as Shakespeare. At court, Edward de Vere was nicknamed Spear Shaker due to his ability at both at tournaments and because his writing. His coat of arms featured a lion wielding a spear. Perhaps coincidentally, Edward de Vere lived in the same area as Shakespeare. His Bolton Hall home beginning the Avon River and the forests of Aden on another. And that's all I have.
The question may still linger, did Shakespeare really write all the poems and plays he is being credited to? You could sit here and argue the fact that Edward de Vere is the main author, but the same can be done for William Shakespeare. My partner and I believe the true author is William Shakespeare. Therefore, the plays of William Shakespeare should not be attributed to Edward de Vere. Evidence for my first reasoning is that he was known with very small amount of people, and they do say they have seen his work being done by Shakespeare himself. He was known in a relatively close-knit society. He was part of a group of players who worked openly among themselves, each of them taking on various jobs related to putting on their plays beside their stage work. This was not the era of specialization in theater. They didn't have a luxury of rehearsing a play for a month or two, and they spent a lot of time on the road together, especially during plague season. In other words, Shakespeare didn't write in secret in an ivory tower, so examine this background against claims that various earls or men of science wrote the works. He was also known among his own contemporary playwrights. Barnum and Bailey once said that you can't fool people all the time. Ben Jonson was a great rival of his and also a great admirer. He might have fooled some. I doubt he could have fooled a playwright of the stature of Ben Jonson. Other jealous and lesser playwrights criticized him, but there was not one during his own lifetime who ever suggested that he was not the author of his own plays. With the rivalries and the strong jealousies, this argues strongly for Shakespeare's authenticity. The argue for Essex is based on names and play place names that supposedly Shakespeare would not have had access to, and on an acquaintance with the court that he would not have had. Yet we know that his own people are related to ranking Catholic families in an era of persecution which would have made ties even closer. We know that London was a port city and as such cosmopolitan, so that these names and the place names would not have been out of his ken. We also know that he presented at court, and a playwright of his caliber by nature would have been a keen observer of people and their manners and mores. Indeed, he shows an acquaintance with the lower classes of society as well, that were understandable in a man who moved between worlds than in an aristocrat. Some more evidence that Shakespeare was the author are that James I watched many of his performances, commending the king's men personally for their performances of the Merchant of Venice in 1605. Shakespeare also performed for Queen Elizabeth at her court The Merry Wives of Water in 1596 and A Midsummer's Night's Dream in 1603. Many other people had some more comments about Shakespeare. Voltaire stepped into the ring by saying Shakespeare is a drunken savage with some imagination whose plays please only in London and Canada, before adding that Shakespeare is a Corneille of London, but everywhere else he is a great fool. Mark Twain, one of the most famous doubters, author of the essay Is Shakespeare Dead, wrote, so far as anybody actually knows and can prove, Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon never wrote a play in his life. Sigmund Freud, whose own work is often equated with Shakespeare's in its cultural impact and who drew heavily on Hamlet for some of his own theories, also believed that someone other than the actor from Stratford wrote the plays. It is undoubtedly painful to all of us, he said, that even now we don't know who was the author of the comedies, tragedies, and sonnets of Shakespeare. In the words of Margaret Drabble, over 200 years after Shakespeare died, doubts were raised about the authenticity of his work. The product largely of snobbery, there are best answered by the facts that the monument to William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon compares him to Socrates and Virgil, and that Johnson's verse in the folio identify the author of that volume as the Sweet Swan of Avon.
Okay, to rebuttal from our partners' debate, we have these proofs against them. You guys said something about him being in Oxford, the 17th Earl of Oxford. If he was such high in playwrights, why did he feel like he needed to be so popular in the lower levels of writing? Yes, he may have been prosecuted for being so, but is it worth it if it's not known with the popular people? They said that you guys said that Earl Oxford is known to have composed, directed, and acted in plays around the same time as Shakespeare, but they never said what plays he was in, what plays he directed, and which ones he composed. So how do you know they're the same ones that he would have time to direct and do all those with Shakespeare's plays at the same time he would do his own? You guys also said that people found a lot of similarities in Edward Vere's and Shakespeare's plays and poems, but isn't it true that most writers can have similarities in their writing, and it's not just one person who thinks differently than anyone else? And then you said there's a lot of things similar to Edward's life and the character of Hamlet. But Shakespeare also had a son who passed away at a young age, not being able to keep Shakespeare's name going, whose name was Hamnet. And wouldn't you say it's a coincidence that Hamnet and Hamlet are basically almost, I guess, the same name? And then some things we'd like to point out is that Edward de Vere died too early to be able to complete the later plays that Shakespeare wrote. And then their names, Shakespeare Shaker was Edward de Vere's nickname, and Shakespeare was the writer of the plays. And wouldn't you say everyone can have a nickname? It doesn't have to be so similar, I guess. That's it. That's all.
First off, very few people knew him or knew anything about him. Most of the world said that Shakespeare is a fool, a fake, a fraud. There was no proof of anything that he did. He went to school every once in a while, and his teacher even told that he was absent more than he ever showed up. Shakespeare's work reflects heavily off of the work of Edward de Vere, which is kind of suspicious, I guess you could say. Edward had exceeded his scholars when he was in school, and he got so smart that his scholars couldn't even help him. He used pen names when he was writing, and since his nickname was Spear Shaker, most scholars believe that he could have just used Shakespeare as his pen name. And his life was, I can't freestyle this. Yeah. Queen Elizabeth had seen many of his plays that he had written and other people had acted out, and he was one of the first to ever write sonnets and plays and stuff, and they were all acted out in the Queen's courts and places like that. Only people from Avon really know this guy. Everybody else says he's a fake and that there's no proof for anything other than that everybody says that he was not mentally capable of writing this quality of work.
He said that his ferocity surpassed Noah's ability to instruct him. So he was a very knowledgeable person and knew what he was talking about when he wrote and also he had not only knowledge, but he had experience from acting and writing prior to his knowledge. He formed Lesbian court, and he wrote from anything about religion, music, and anything he could ever write about. He went to school in multiple places, such as Cambridge and St. John's College. He during his lifetime he lived at the Cecil House, and every day he'd study dancing, French, Latin, philosophy, writing, exercising, drawing, and common prayers. So every day he wrote, and in different languages. Yep, that's it.
In response to the affirmative rebuttal, you said that that Shakespeare never went to school, but in the notes that we took, it said that his family took school seriously, and his dad made him go, so therefore he had to. Shakespeare, proof that he wrote his plays. Shakespeare never wrote his plays by himself or in private. He always had a group of people around him that he was acquainted with, so they would see that he actually wrote them. And then our third point is you said that De Vere could have used Shakespeare as a pen name, but that doesn't explain for his family and his kids. Are they De Vere's kids or? Okay, I don't know what to say. I'm done.
As a conclusion to our debate, with that being said, I think it is time to honor William Shakespeare for his great playwrights and poems. It takes someone very talented to write in such a mysterious ways for people to even doubt it was him. Or maybe he wanted you to question it in the later years. Thank you.
Okay. From his knowledge, or from high knowledge to his experience, Edward de Vere was a talented writer. He acted, directed, and wrote. His nickname was far too close to Shakespeare. In conclusion, my partner and I believe that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, should be attributed credit for this, because very few people knew of Shakespeare. Few documents or verifiable sources of his life exist, much fewer than would be expected of such a prominent figure. Originals of none of his manuscripts have survived. Not one document exists giving evidence of anyone ever seeing him. Not even his own family ever referred to him as a famous playwright. I believe that Edward de Vere is a true author. Shakespeare. More proof that he didn't exist was on his tombstone. It wrote, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be ye man that spares the stones, and cursed he that moves my bones." And why would a gravestone have such an injunction? The answer has to be that there was no Shakespeare, there were no bones, there was no body. And a woman from New England named